Okay, good morning. Thanks everyone for coming. I know it's early and we're in the middle of the conference, so I admire your persistence already. Hopefully you've had a good chance to hit the floor and interact with a bunch of folks. The good news is I have nothing to sell you, so hopefully we can have some collaboration and share some cool ideas. And I'd ask that you guys, if you get a chance, connect on LinkedIn and offer your feedback. The goal for me on this entire endeavor is really to share some information that I found useful in my career, and then hopefully to learn back from the community and then be able to package that up and continue sharing that through some of the work that my co-author and I have done. So I'm Matt Sharp, and I wrote a book that we published about a year ago. It's called The CISO Evolution: Business Knowledge for Cybersecurity Executives. I previously was the CISO for a company called LogicWorks based out of the Northeast, moving people to the cloud and then managing their managing their infrastructure, a long-tail recurring revenue business model. And we exited that business and sold to Cox Communications at the end of February. So I'm now currently, this is what I'm doing, this and hanging out on a small ranch in Mexico. My co-author, Rock Lambros, was not able to make it this morning, so if you came to see Rock, who's probably a little bit more charismatic than me, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, but hopefully I can cover the content as compelling as he would have, and we'll, like I said, we'll look to engage and hopefully have him out next year if we get an opportunity to present in front of the group again. Okay, so I think that's some of the basics. Where do we start? So today, the world is more digital, disrupted, and regulated than it ever has been. And at the same time, what we're seeing is innovations from a number of different angles. And we'll just call out a few. Of course, the advancement of artificial intelligence, the innovation around blockchain and digital currencies, and the continued innovation and investment that goes into virtual reality or the metaverse or Web3 or however you want to describe these things. And so what that means is that we're going to continue to see faster pace of evolution, increasing levels of regulation, and of course, we'll encounter much more aggressive disruption across all scales of business. So that is to say, the skills that got you where you are today, made you successful in your role today, are not going to be the skills that will find favor in the future. And this is true for you, and this is true for your team. So this is a CXO track, and so my presumption is that most folks have a composition of teams and they're looking to both inspire growth in themselves as well as make sure that their teams are equipped to handle the changing business landscape. So today what I want to do is walk through a framework that so we originally did this as a keynote at Rocky Mountain InfoSec back in July of 2022. And so a lot of the content now seems much less prophetic, because some of the things are not even like predictions, they've already happened. But the thing that I hope that everybody is able to take away is perhaps the pattern for framing up the development plan, perhaps some of the key resources, in most cases they're free or low cost. And then the other thing is maybe helping identify opportunities to create clarity around signal to noise. So there's, if you're like me, I have my entire desktop filled with reports that I should read, that I think, oh, I should read this, like, oh, this Sophos came out with a thing, Fortinet came out with a thing, the guys over at Night Dragon or Wild Ventures just published some really interesting stuff. Dang, I gotta like keep up on this stuff. So the thought was, can we narrow down, focus on some of the resources, and gain insights on what seems to be more and more popular again is this conversation around geopolitics and of course the macroeconomics. and using the insights that we extract from those pieces of information or data sources, identify trends, and then start to skill ourselves and our teams in order to be responsive, or in many cases, like Tony Spinelli, who helped lead the digital transformation over at Capital One, would say, be at the front, charging forward and helping the innovation, as opposed to waiting for the business to innovate and then having to catch up from a security perspective. And so I think there's some really interesting opportunities in front of everybody, wrapped up in a couple of places. Okay, this is a disclaimer. Hopefully you guys have seen this in every RSA session. So I'll give that an opportunity. So here's our agenda. About 10 years ago, and $500,000 worth of book sales, Malcolm Harkins, the former CISO of Intel, came out of a finance background, and he put some innovation into a book on information security management, and he talked about the evolution. So at the time, people were talking about a T-shaped individual, and that was breadth in IT skills and depth in business, or rather the opposite, breadth in business and depth in IT. And in order to basically to have a highly performant IT organization, you needed this structure. So he's adapted that and created the Z-shaped individual. And in this case, we're adding an additional dimension, and that dimension, of course, is risk and security. And so in order to frame the conversation today, what I thought we would do is take the Z-shaped individual and identify some sort of salient trends that we've been seeing continually crop up, and maybe put some structure around those trends, make some predictions about what's going to happen, and then ideally offer some resources and the potential for a framework of creating a development plan that can be applied, again, at an individual or teaming level. So the first one is cyber resilience, and for me, this fits right into business acumen. The second one is digital transformation. Of course, that's about the technology breadth. And the last piece is cyber risk quantification. And I think this is an innovation that's helping us in the risk and security depth perspective or dimension. Okay, so like I said, definition, discussion, prediction, development plan. And we'll do that 3 times, and then we'll wrap it up with some, with the 30, 60, 90 action plan. Okay, so what is resilience? We're hearing this, gosh, I just can't stop hearing it. We're hearing it all over the place. It's become one of these buzzwords. It's become a little bit diluted, sort of like Zero Trust went through this sort of experience a couple of years ago. There's a number of different resources out there. You can obviously go with a very generic definition, or narrow down into something that's very specific to cyber security and resilience in cybersecurity. So in this case, we've picked, and I'd like to use the definition from NIST SP 800-160. And this is some work that Ron Ross and some other folks have done, which really is starting to set the stage for what exactly does resilience mean. And it's a fairly robust series of papers that really dives in. And then I think you can complement some of the work that Ron has done with work that's coming out of the Digital Directors Network, DDN.network, and Bob Zoukis and other folks over there published a book on systemic risk titled The Great Reboot, and that's also a great resource. So, so specifically, if I can just call out a couple of things, we're gonna, whoops, wrong button. We're gonna focus here on anticipate, withstand, adapt, and recover. Where did recover go? Recover. All right, so here we go. So in my perspective, I think the sort of the evolution from traditional business continuity management will become more clear as we dive into this. All businesses are complex systems, right? So what I mean by a complex system is, as a business, you're looking to achieve whatever those stated goals are, and you have a series of departments, and those departments are supported by a series of processes and teams, as well as probably outsourced vendors, and each of those different sort of cascading levels of abstraction and complexity combine to create create a complex system. But they can each be decomposed and pulled apart in order to sort of analyze each one individually. And so I think what we've done historically is really focus on analyzing each piece individually, but we haven't looked at those in aggregate. And so what we're seeing now is a focus on really putting things in a much more appropriate and broad context. So we're seeing innovations like CyberGRX, one of the companies that I advise, has started to do cross-portfolio analysis in third-party risk and be able to, in addition to that, provide predictive analytics before you run a vendor through the procurement cycle. We've also seen some recent papers come out that I think are worth looking at. The National Association of Corporate Directors released their new 2023 Cybersecurity Handbook, and in there they end up spending a decent amount of time talking about resilience and cyber risk quantification. And they developed that in partnership with the CIS, with ISA, and then you also see some really interesting commentary coming out from a couple of other things. The NIST CSF just dropped for comment yesterday, and there's a bunch of commentary on governance and context for how we fit in broader supply chains and how you fit into the broader industry. And then the last piece that I think is really interesting is Google's cyber action team that's led by Phil Venables, who came over from Goldman Sachs to go and run security at Google Cloud. And they're providing a bunch of really great content on board communications, as well as actually a really nice primer at the end of the document on what we can do in the context of AI. So the takeaway from this slide is we have these 4 core areas, and we have systemic risk that we need to examine in order to introduce resilience and stop having a brittle environment. And in particular, there are a number of great resources, which I just mentioned, that I think are helping us frame how we should be thinking about that, and also helping boards of directors and other folks who are probably not as familiar with the cyber disciplines think about and understand how to properly provide governance in the context of broader organizational management. So I mentioned the CISO Evolution. We wrote a book called The CISO Evolution: Business Knowledge for Cybersecurity Executives, and in that book we basically talk about how to pick up and leverage the business model canvas. So this is a tool that I was introduced to through my MBA program, and basically it gives you these 9 boxes in a really convenient way to decompose a business model. So the book that this is actually pulled from is called The Business Model Generation, and it's designed for innovation, is really the purpose, and to create a standard framework for a common dialogue around how does a business actually operate. And so as I went through my MBA, I was leading the cybersecurity team at Crocs, the shoe company. And so I started to, of course, apply the things I was learning in my MBA to my job. And what I learned was actually really compelling. As I started to decompose the business and get much more familiar, it became much more convenient and straightforward for me to hold conversations with the executive leadership team. And I was able to articulate using common language and talking about systems in an appropriate way. And then I was able to sort of cascade, how do we have bundles of services or SaaS products or assets and applications, and how do we tie this to the real value creation engines that exist inside of our business? So all of that is to say, the Business Model Canvas is a great tool. I recommend it to leaders because it helps you engage in a more meaningful dialogue with your business. But the other thing that it does, with more and more of our workforce being millennials, is help us connect the activities that we're doing on a day-to-day basis to mission and outcomes. And what that means is that we're able to provide meaning to the work that folks are delivering. And so you can capture more hearts and minds and provide a more compelling reason stick around and really put the extra discretionary effort into protecting or driving forward the mission inside the business. Okay, so cyber resiliency we've talked about in some sort of abstract terms, and so I wanted to spend a few minutes sort of highlighting a handful of traits that seem to match with cyber resiliency. And as I got this pulled together, what I realized is that's a lot of words. So you are all able to download the slides and review those. What I want to do is maybe talk about sort of what does this look like over the course of my career and probably many of yours. So if you look back 5, 10, 15 years, what you found is that we were going into larger organizations and building these business continuity plans. And they would get printed, and they were like 500 pages, and they were in this red binder, and you shoved it in the CIO's office somewhere, and you hoped to never use the thing, right? And it covered all of these really interesting scenarios. And then what would happen is something would go awry, and an incident response team would be triggered, and then at some point, somebody who's not in IT gets involved, and at that point, that huge manual and all of that invested work was promptly discarded and never referenced again in the heat of battle, right? So then the other things that we did was we brought in a SEM, and we started to feed it bits and pieces of information, but we struggled to correlate. And then we decided that we wanted to focus on defense in depth, and so we started to add more and more point solutions, and over time that became expense in depth, and what became clear is that we were adding more and more capabilities, and we weren't really clear on like what were we achieving, and we really struggled to articulate to our leadership how much is enough, right? How much is enough? This is a very simple question. And so some other things that we did was once a year we did a penetration test. So you can see as we started to build these systems, we created these very brittle systems. And then of course we failed to anticipate that these systems were going to fail. And so we had really no backup plan. So our controls fail, and then our best backup plan was actually like a lessons learned plan, lessons learned at the tail end of a failure. And hopefully we captured those lessons learned and we fed them back in, but we did it so infrequently that our feedback loop was slow, and oftentimes we found ourselves in trouble. All right, so now what does the future look like in resilience? So we'll talk about cyber risk quantification a little bit later, but in my opinion, we're going to start to quantify risk and hold a much more meaningful conversation about how do we transfer, mitigate, and create reserves in order to be resilient from a financial perspective. And then supplementing that, we'll be able to articulate what are the perils that we'll suffer from, what are the controls that directly correlate with those perils, how can we map those in combination with insights in adversarial playbooks. And then building on that, we can start to introduce a more real-time response. So you've got tools like Axonius that's doing real-time inventories for your assets. And you can start to marry business context by leveraging insights and creating customized queries from your business impact analysis so that you can auto-tag vulnerabilities in your vulnerability risk management with business context in addition to threat context, right? And you can narrow down what you're focusing on by focusing on only the exploits that are really meaningful, right? The stuff that's coming out from CISA as known exploits. And then, of course, as we're starting to get closer and closer to what Gartner describes as a cyber mesh architecture, you have all of these point solutions, mostly in the big providers today, being cobbled together so that your network stuff talks to your endpoint stuff. And at some point, we'll move to robust, resilient data lakes with standardized or normalized communication flows between these tools, and we'll be able to automate responses, right? So I think, as you can see, it's operating year-round, and it's being able to do those 4 things that we talked about. And then I think the last thing that we need to do is move away from these big incident management playbooks and have lean frameworks that can guide and enable decision-making in the heat of battle. And then we can do training with the guidance and insight of folks like CISA and the FBI, in addition to other players in the ecosystem that we operate. So if you're in critical infrastructure, you can understand how your tabletop interacts with folks that are upstream or downstream from you inside of the total value chain. And so we've started to see some things like CISA offers free tabletop assessments, and they'll help coordinate collaboration with the FBI, and you can bring in some of your vendors and do things like that. Okay, so this is a compare and contrast for me about kind of how things have been done historically and where we're moving. And of course, APIs in the cloud and digital transformation are going to enable a bunch of that. So now we look, what did we talk about? Systems thinking, business principles, and business continuity are probably these large core concepts, right? And I think in some cases you need these fundamentals or foundations to drive much more resilient architectures, more resilient teaming structures, and so forth. And so, you know, for many folks, I think you probably have some of the basics already captured. And so this is essentially intended to direct folks towards what are some of the resources if you have gaps, or if you notice gaps in the communication that's happening between your team and the business. And you know what those gaps are, or you can identify them because you'll see frustration and you'll see friction, and oftentimes you'll see, you know, shadow IT and all of the other things that just demonstrate that you're not really fully aligned. Okay, so digital transformation. We have a definition. It's basically using technology in order to deliver increasing levels of value to increasing numbers of customers. And why do we care? Well, the reality is boards care, so you should care, and the reason they care is because they have a fiduciary duty, and 50% of the S&P and 50% of the Fortune 500 are not going to exist in 10 years. It's just going to be gone, and that's actually based on data as we look backwards. So the chances are that number will be higher going forward. The rate of innovation, the rate of disruption is so high that this is a critical imperative inside of the boardroom. So we should care. Now, digital transformation is more than just automating a few things, right? It's more than a Lambda function that helps you get through a particular thing, or a Python script that helps you get data from A to B, or what have you. And so I think there's some really good thought process that took place here on this blog. And they talk about process transformation. So what is process transformation? In this case, since the 80s, Pizza Hut has been the #1 pizza joint in the nation. And with the innovation of from Domino's to allow folks to order their pizza from a mobile app, they managed to displace and usurp Pizza Hut as the #1 pizza joint. Business model transformation, of course, if you look back, we were shipping CDs or DVDs in the mail, and obviously that turned into full content delivery at scale with some additional innovations and increases in speed from Netflix. And then domain transformation is about, like, so Amazon started as a retailer online. They turned that business, the fastest growing, most profitable portion of their business is a completely different domain. It's in delivering IT services, right? Amazon Web Services. And then they didn't stop there, they went and bought a grocery store. And they didn't stop there, they went into healthcare. And they didn't stop there, and so forth. So that's domain transformation. So of course, AWS is doing a combination of several of these things, right? And then the last thing I think is a good call out is Experian, and Experian has done a great job in a cultural transformation. And part of that cultural transformation includes cybersecurity and the way that the entire company interacts with these digital platforms. So, I'm participating in the NACD's directorship certification. So I'm a candidate to become a certified board director. And through that course, this is one of the slides, and we talked, and so you can see, you know, going back, they had to produce the content, and this content was pulled from the deck more than a year ago. The call-outs are, these are the disruptive forces that will change the way that we do business. And if this is the conversation that's happening at the board level, then you can be sure that this is where innovation is going to come from and where investment is going to sort of funnel into. And of course, some of these things have already come to fruition. So we started to talk on blockchain, or AI, and virtual and augmented reality. But of course, there's some other things to be thinking about depending on your specific industry. So the question is like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. Is it too late? Do I even bother tackling the learning curve? And so what I wanted to do was put some of the things that we're talking about in context with some of the things we're more familiar with, so that we can see how they're developing and on what timeline or time scale. And so Gartner allows you to actually build your own custom hype cycle. And so the purpose here is really to sort of to balance, like, where are we? Where do we think we are with swarming robotics or AI ops platforms with respect to DevSecOps or CASBs or CSPM, for example? And so I think it makes more visceral, like, we saw the slow innovation or introduction and disruption of some of these products, and then we saw consolidation and acquisitions, and we saw some of these products come into maturity, and we adapted, and we watched some of the internal processes respond or not, and we saw teams built up around these things. And so the point here is to just kind of place things in context. So skills matrix for the cloud. So this is essentially the development thinking that I used when I moved from Denver out to New York to go take the CISO role for LogicWorks. And I went to go be the CISO of this innovative company that had completely disrupted the managed services space in order to be a meaningful player in the DevOps or SRE space. And so over a number of years, I started with CCSP, added some certs like AWS and Azure, and then sort of went through, we saw an evolution from CloudFormation or ARM templates to Terraform coming out of HashiCorp, and then that evolved into obviously a bigger focus on Kubernetes and more dynamic delivery of workloads through containerization and then eventually through serverless. So this was essentially my career, like a technical learning plan that in many cases didn't really have much to do with cybersecurity, but so that I could continue to play a role in helping customers gain trust and confidence that we understood what we were doing so that we could close deals and continue to acquire customers and grow revenue. Okay, some of the other things that we talked about, blockchain, AI/ML, and virtual and augmented reality. There's free resources out there. So believe it or not, MIT, Stanford, Columbia, and the University of Singapore are offering these free courses that give you an opportunity to, with a minimal investment and of your time, really get up to speed on what are the foundations or fundamentals of some of these innovative forces that are going to completely change the way that we do business. So again, maybe you've got a DevSecOps architect who you want to point towards blockchain, or you've got an AppSec person who you want to make sure can at least have the basic understanding of how crypto contracts can be exploited. Of course, I don't know how you guys have experienced this RSA, but I have heard so many innovative ways to use ChatGPT. My mind is like blown, completely blown. I heard of a guy who's tied his email to ChatGPT, so anything that's got his email, he's redirecting and having ChatGPT craft 3 plausible responses, and then putting that as a draft in his email so that when he reads his email, he has a pre-crafted response that's likely to be correct, and all he has to do is hit send or make some moderate tweaks. We talked the other day, one of the most compelling conversations I had was with John Willis, who wrote the Phoenix Project, and more recently Investments Unlimited. And he was talking about how they've been able to develop complete applications through simple dialogue. I didn't realize not only could you build the applications, but you could ask it to actually launch and run that, which means there's enough wherewithal to build a stack and execute code in the same way that Lambda or Azure Functions do. And this is all happening in ChatGPT today. All right. How are we doing on time? 15, great. So, give me a sec here. So I'm blazing fast. My pacing is totally good. So we talked about the Z-shaped individual, and we talked about cyber resilience, and we referenced a bunch of great resources. And then we talked about digital transformation, being many types of digital transformation, and of course, a handful of technologies that are going to enable that. And in most cases, I think our cybersecurity programs are ill-equipped or completely unaware, and we're going to do the same thing that we did when infrastructure as a service and then SaaS came out. We're going to get dragged into a room, if we're lucky, and told about something as the thing is getting launched. And then we're going to scramble and get frustrated and say, hey, how come I wasn't included in the conversation up front? And of course, the answer is going to be because you couldn't add value to the conversation. So I think all of that really sets the stage for engaging in meaningful dialogue. And so I want to add something that's related to the discipline of delivering cybersecurity. So some of the things that we struggle with in cyber, in my opinion, is, do I have enough budget? Like, I can't tell you the number of times I have looked at a whole bunch of baseline reports, and they're not always perfect fits, but Gartner publishes the, how many AppSec people per developer, or how much, what percentage of IT budget do you have, or what percent did your budget grow by, or all of these different things. And of course, I've taken those in a failed conversation to my CIO or my CFO or whatever, and said, see, look, we're not doing enough. And of course, that never really results in anything. So I think cyber risk quantification gives us finally an opportunity to get aligned. There are a few more obstacles. So there are some innovative companies out there, and we'll talk about my experience with Cover, that are doing some really cool things. And what's become clear through conversation with folks like Rich Seierson, who's probably the forefront trailblazer in the entire quantification space. He's the one that wrote the Green Book on how to measure anything, and he wrote Metrics Manifesto and several others. He's also running some workshops this week on how to build a defensible budget using cyber risk quantification. So if you get a chance, look up resilience. And so Rich's comment to me was, people don't have a cyber risk quantification problem. They have other problems that cyber risk quantification as a technology can partially solve, and we need to wrap a handful of other things around that. So hopefully the things that we're wrapping around it are fundamentally based in some things that we've just talked about, like having a clear, intimate understanding of value creation engines and valuation inside of your business leads you then to be able to hold a much more meaningful conversation once equipped with the quantification stuff. The other thing that I think has really, in my experience, was a learning process was just because we can quantify something doesn't mean that you've created inherent buy-in, right? So you have to, just like AI, you have to create explainability around the models that you're using. And so one of the things that was helpful for me was to include my finance team in the creation of the models, so that when we finally got to the delivery of conversation and risk committees and stuff, there wasn't questions about just the basics, like how did you decide that XYZ had an earning potential, XYZ's business unit had an earning potential of A, B, or C? Or how did you decide that this particular business unit, if disrupted, would result in a loss of whatever number of dollars of revenue, right? And so the other thing, the other thing that was useful was then to compare this to maturity models and kind of what is the control deployment that we have. So once you understand, again, value creation engines, and you marry that with the context of what we're doing inside of the controls, and you can pick your framework, then we can start to hold conversations about securing funding and allocating that properly both to our organizations and inside of our organizations, in order to produce a probabilistic return on investment. And then we can decide this control either is or isn't a good investment. And the other thing that we can do is we can stack rank, and we can say, this is the investment that can reduce my risk exposure with the highest return on investment. And oftentimes, I think people are surprised by which are those controls. Some guidance has been provided by the insurance industries, but the reality is they don't understand our businesses. They're using base rate analysis. Okay, I'm way out ahead of myself. Cyber risk quantification, what is it? So, as many folks may know, we've now gotten to the point through a number of data collection opportunities that we can provide meaningful quantification, right? We've seen a number of insurers basically participate in an industry to create land grab, and then translate that land grab later into long-term recurring business with existing customers. And of course, your options are be able to transfer a meaningful amount of risk at a skyrocketing premium or not at all. And that's the way the insurance industry has been behaving over the last few years. And so we've seen, 8, 10 X, or sometimes you're just uninsurable, be the case for many organizations. And behind all of that engine, what they're doing is essentially creating regression models, and they're running those through Monte Carlo analysis, right? So this is not dramatically different than, for example, in the CISO evolution, where we talked about building a business case using a Monte Carlo analysis and then presenting net present value for that investment, because there was the potential for increasing revenue in the business model that I was in. So you can gain a probabilistic understanding. It's not perfect, right? We saw folks like Nate Silver back in the election a few years ago miscalculate and basically assure us that Trump was not going to win an election, and then he did. So these sort of corner cases do happen, but they're not a foundation for great decision making. So why do we care? Again, remember, definition, why do we care, predictions. So the reason that we care is, of course, there's increasing levels of regulation wrapped up around this. So, of course, the SEC has their proposed rules, which has created a big buzz, lots of dialogue, plenty of conversation. And inside of those rules from the SEC specifically, they talk about doing disclosures of meaningful risk in aggregate, right? So the question is, how do you combine 3 mediums and a high? Well, you can't, right? So you can't disclose meaningful risk in aggregate unless you're quantifying risk. Germany has some laws that are coming out. I think the NACD's most recent cybersecurity handbook talks about quantification in very specific terms. They talk about asset-based quantification, and they talk about actuarial quantification. And so I think if these are the resources that, again, are being leveraged and used to educate the people who are going to provide broad-based governance across the business landscape, then of course we need to be equipped to hold the conversation they're going to come looking for, because they're being told that this is possible, and they're being told that it's the best path forward. The other reason that we care is because it makes the conversation easier. So we'll do an example. Just, I think, demonstrating that is really helpful. And then the last thing is actually to drive action, right? So many times we can have great strategies and procure great technologies, but if those things don't get properly deployed or maintained, or we don't have strong user adoption, then we have gaps in our security protocols. So, bummer, this is the wrong slide. So this is really difficult to read, and I apologize for that. I thought we had redone this. So what you see here is called a loss exceedance curve. And a loss exceedance curve basically gives you the opportunity to move up and down the line And typically it's done with one curve, but in this case you can see there are several curves. And so what you can see I've got a pointer. What you can see here is there's a 1% probability of approximately a $1.4 billion or greater loss. So basically, this point represents what the probability of loss on the long tail represented to the right. So you can have a total loss exceedance curve, and then you can decompose this loss exceedance curve in order to talk about the most common perils, and then obviously those perils can be insured against. And so when you look at this and you hold a conversation with somebody, you establish a risk appetite, and that risk appetite will say, are you okay with a 1% chance of a $1.4 billion loss? And if the answer is yes, great, we're done. We have a risk appetite. And if the answer is no, then the question is, well, how are we going to fix this? Are we going to add to the reserves? Are we going to increase our insurance coverage? Or are we going to implement new controls? And of course, the most efficient way to reduce or mitigate this risk is actually implementing controls. Okay, so once you've done that, then the next question is, what are the controls that directly relate to a particular peril or set of perils? And what is the probability or the average loss exposure that you will have? And not only that, then you can go through a budgeting process. And again, apologize for the slide here. So in this case, what we're saying is this secure configurations for hardware had an average effect of reducing our exposure by $3.8 million. And in order to implement the proper controls that are defined to move from a level 1 to a level 2 maturity, we would spend $2.9 million, which gives us a net annualized loss expectancy ROI of 32%, right? So then you stack rank this against all the other projects that you have, and maybe you evaluate which ones are low-hanging fruit, and then you can decide in a very defensible way. We decided to do A, B, and C, but not D or E because we didn't have the funds or because there wasn't capacity in the team or whatever the things were. So capital allocation is, how big is my budget and where do I place my dollars? And we can achieve this with existing tools today. So what's the future? And then we'll do, and then sort of the same pattern applies. The future is we're going to create direct connectivity into existing controls and existing software in order to understand exactly what is the current configuration, status, coverage of my controls across an environment, and have real-time dashboards that enable real-time continuous decision making. And that's already in the works with some of the vendors. And then the other thing is the perils associated with IoT, blockchain, and AI are completely different. And so we need new models to combine those exposures into basically the innovations in our business models. So how do you get from wherever you are to being able to leverage these tools? Of course, you need to have statistical and probabilistic literacy in order to describe these things. One of the things that I thought was really great was calibration training, because it's a nice primer and exposure, and Doug Hubbard and Jack Jones, they offer those trainings. They're really great. Vendor engagement, of course. You can ask the vendors to help us tackle this learning curve, and I gave you an example of what we've done with Cover, but there are obviously several other vendors out there. One of the things that I did with my senior cloud compliance manager was run him through a Python course, and then we experimented a bit with Metrics Manifesto. And now I'm excited to go back and mess around with ChatGPT and see if it can write some of the same code that Rich Seierson wrote in Metrics Manifesto in R. And then the last thing that I think is getting the storyline right before we go into the conversation. And I'm really excited about the work that Chris Cochran and Ron Eddings have done around telling really compelling stories in the world of cybersecurity. So next week, you should identify the key resources that you want to pay attention to and filter out the noise. Then, in the next 3 months, get clear on what are you interested in? What's relevant for your industry? Do you even want to be in that industry? And then decide whether you're making a wholesale change or whether you're going to lean into the things that are likely to impact you. And then within 6 months, you should attempt to try and complete one of those trainings, whether it's an online course or whether it's enrolling for NACD's Accelerate or what have you. So with that, I think I've hit the end of my slides. Hopefully we can do a couple of questions, and thank you for your attention. So any questions, I guess? No? Was any of this new by raise of hand? I'm just curious if maybe, if you guys don't have questions, I got questions. Some of this was new. Okay, that's great. Yeah? Yeah. So the question is, what are the most common KPIs that you should present to the board? So I can tell you, in my experience, most executive teams have a set of 4 or 5 metrics, something that they're really paying attention to, right? And it's usually related to, like, are we continuing to close deals? Are we delivering those deals to generate revenue? Are we doing it profitably? Do we have satisfied customers? And do we have satisfied employees? It's more or less like the balanced scorecard or something along those lines, right? So when you sit down with your business model canvas and you carve that all out, right? And then you sit down and you match what you've learned in the business model canvas about the revenue generating things, you come up with an idea of where is the greatest risk exposure, right? So that's the first piece is, do we properly have, the loss exceedance curve I think is part of the answer. Do we have an agreement on what the risk appetite is as a business, and are we allocating our cash appropriately? Do we need another sales rep, or do we need an MDR, right? So that's one, and then I think it's gonna be dependent on how those metrics look, right? So if you're in a business like I was previously, and we actually do a business model canvas demonstration in the book for LogicWorks, so I'll talk about that publicly. What we did was decompose the business, and then I said, we do 3 things. We accelerate sales, protect the brand, and influence product. How do we accelerate sales? Well, part of it is that we get certified, right? It gets us access to markets. So then the next thing is, once we're shortlisted, right? We're in the shortlist. We've got to earn the trust of the customer. And how do we do that? Well, there's a bunch of different ways that you could contemplate how you're going to do that. But at the end of the day, whatever that leading performance metric is, had better tie and have an ability to actually move the executive KPI that's in your business. So if it's, for us, number of specific touch points with prospects, or number of NDAs that have been signed, so that we can compare, like, what's the rate of deal flow and how often are we actively participating? Or maybe it's the number of customers that rely on a particular compliance regime, because if we don't pass those audits, then we don't have those customers. And if we fail those audits going forward, then we trigger termination clauses. So those are the kinds of things that I would start looking at is, what are my activities specifically, and how are they directly related to the output of the business in a metric that somebody actually gives a shit about? And so we did that sort of repeatedly. And I found it super compelling to just take that list of metrics and decompose it, and then classify. So what we did was we classified leading performance indicators and tail lag indicators, and there's typically a combination of the two. And oftentimes, then you can either identify how you directly correlate or relate to leading performance indicators, or you can allow one of the existing operational metrics in your program to become a leading risk indicator that directly relates to a leading performance indicator, or an OKR, or whatever you want to call them. So Paul Proctor helped me with chapter 4 in the book. It's on valuation, and we do some of these very things. But he did a bunch of research back in like 2014 or 15 where he takes a number of business models and he specifically talks about KPIs, leading risk indicators, and then the things that you can do inside of your security program inside of different business models. So whether that's a tire fleet management company or an airplane manufacturer, or whatever the things are, he's got, I don't know, 80 or 90 metrics that you could look at that are, I think, in my opinion, inspiring to answer that question.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of the application of AI successfully that's been moved into production for a real world business problem in the United States that you were, and how did you build the value for that? And just, do you have a story about that at all?
Um, well, I think there are a number of folks that have done some really interesting things. So I think the folks at Intuit have done a bunch of really great innovation. They're based here in the Bay, around helping people not miskey information when they're filling out their taxes. And that's helped drive and translate into reduced misfilings and reduced fraud as well. I think that's a particular practical example that I've heard of. There's a company called Exactly that's doing a bunch of really innovative things related to go-to-market. I think, you know, there are different kinds of AI and you can classify them differently. I think the other day on information.com they had this really great interview with a panel of experts, and they talked about one of the entrepreneurs is leveraging this generative AI to enhance customer service operations. So I think those are actively in place today. There's some NLP and AI applied by Visio, who's a third-party risk management company, who is taking SOC 2s and auto-parsing them. So your third-party risk management kind of can be accelerated. Gosh, look at, you know, the conference floor has a whole bunch of folks, and I think AI is being, in some cases, overstated, and in other cases, actually adding value. So, yeah, so I don't know, 4 or 5 off the top of my head. Okay, I'm going to do book signing, so happy to continue the conversation over in Moscone South at the bookstore, and please do connect on LinkedIn. I appreciate your attendance, and have a great rest of your conference. Thank you.